All right, hi everyone. So I basically just rewrote everything I wanted to say when I was listening to what is being talked about here and what's not being talked about here. So, okay, the first things to say is that I have fewer pictures because in law we have even, I think, fewer pictures than economics. I also have fewer people to talk about because I think I may be the only real climate lawyer on this massive campus, although we have people working on policy, which I'll talk about. And that's depressing because it's not because we have fewer needs in that area. But anyway, so fewer pictures, fewer people, but lots of stuff to talk about. So I'm going to try to maybe use some of these slides, but also, oops, this is also, lawyers are not super technical. Okay, but I actually just want to lay out the things I want to talk about in the next few minutes, and then hopefully leave time for maybe even more than one question, because I think this is an area where it's better just to kind of lay out here the issues we're thinking about, and tell me what you as non-lawyers know about this area and what you want to know about this area. So the first thing to say is that in the law school, great place, great people, but I spend half my time, anytime I'm even talking to my fellow colleagues, just trying to convince them to care about climate change. So I don't have the benefit of starting in the weeds and thinking about the issues in concrete ways. It's first, here's why climate change is an issue, and here's why it's an issue that we should be thinking about in the legal context. So with that being said, what do I do? So I worked on climate change law kind of writ large for a while now. So I'm really interested in the evolution of international climate change law, why it looks the way it does, how it operates, why it hasn't been terribly successful, and what we're trying to do to make it more successful. I've also done a lot of comparative work looking at what, oops, I forgot I'm supposed to stand closer to the microphone. What we're doing in the United States versus what's happening in the rest of the world and why those differences exist. So why has the European Union done more in the legal context than we have? So what are the socio-legal drivers? But I also have thought about a lot of kind of complementary issues, such as, as climate change progresses, what does that mean for the Arctic? And from a governance perspective. So as those, as the ice disappears and those waters open up, we have different states, Russia, the US, others who are going to want to use that area. Who has the right to use it, and how are we going to settle those really increasingly tense disputes? But then I've also thought about what we think of as the third rail. It's really interesting to hear you refer to adaptation as the third rail, because in the legal context, since 2009, we've treated mitigation and adaptation basically as co-equals, and our third rail is geoengineering, okay, right? And so, how are we going to govern decision-making in that context? Because we do not have legal structures and governance structures to govern decisions related to solar radiation management, carbon dioxide removal, and so these are all things that I think about. I also think a lot about equity and justice in the climate change context. How does international law respond to not only the collective action problems that are posed, but how does it really respond to the fact that climate change is going to have negative effects earlier on and worse for those countries who are contributing less to the emissions? And so those are the kind of things that I think a lot about and work on. All big issues, all of which have endless amounts of frustration, but little inroads of progress, kind of sometimes. Now, others on campus. So you've heard about some of them already, and so I won't repeat them. Noah Dormandy and Glenn is working on energy, which is really, really important, because from a mitigation perspective, anything we do in the energy context related to law, we need that kind of input. Alex Thompson in politics and IR. He's worked on international environmental politics for years, and he's done some really important work on climate financing. But in terms of climate law, kind of in a straightforward way, there's just not a lot of people working in this space. And it's actually at Ohio State and even internationally. It's starting to change, but that is the case. Okay, so now, as a little bit of a frame, so I actually talked in Gil's engineering class yesterday, and one of the things that I emphasized in that class is that, as lawyers, we see the world in geopolitical terms. And so when we think about problems, whether it's climate change or something else, we think about it, in jurisdictional ways. Like, are we thinking at the city level with adaptation? Are we thinking at the state level, the international level? And I was asking his students who are engineers, how do you see the world? And they were talking, problem-based, cycle-based, and we're trying to think about ways to kind of link these things up. And as lawyers, I see that as one of our biggest jobs, and also one of the things that we don't do really well, is thinking about how to actually make laws and policies that are reflective of, you know, the cycles that exist and the way that people see things. And so a lot of the work in this space really is about thinking about translating all of the work that's being done on this campus into laws and policies that will affect human behavior and the way we think human behavior should be changing, right? So all of this work on what farmers are doing and what they can do, you know, law is a tool for incentivizing that, for mobilizing that. Okay, anyway. So here's a very brief roadmap for what I want to talk about in the next few minutes. And again, I do want to leave some time for questions. The first is why law matters. So maybe I come into this conversation assuming you all think law matters, and maybe you don't, right? And so I want to at least talk about why the rule of law matters. And then I want to kind of give you a perspective on what climate change law looks like. And in particular, I want to convince you that there's 3 levels of climate change law: international climate change law, domestic climate change law, and then sub-federal climate change law, and that all 3 of those are really important and functioning in different ways. Okay, so why law matters. Okay, so first of all, you all here in this room, you're here because you've already bought into the fact that this is an important issue to talk about. But in the climate change law context, that is not where we start, okay? As you know from just looking at the news. So, you know, we start by saying to law and policymakers, scientific evidence tells us climate change is happening. We're well beyond the conventional standards burden of proof to establish the basis for a legal response to this shared challenge. It is a collective action challenge, and we need law as a tool not only to mobilize individual behavior, but, and this is really important, to change corporate behavior, okay? Because in the context of energy, even in the context of adaptation, what corporations are doing really, really matters. So law, historically, we think is a very important and effective tool for effecting social change. And so once we identify an area where we think we need social change, law can be a really important tool for mobilizing that social change and addressing the issue. Now, a lot of research has also been done, you know, we're thinking here in the US right now, but a lot of research has also been done just about the general role of the rule of law. And what that research shows is that the rule of law, as in having a system of law that people respect and that governs social relationships, not just in the environmental context, but generally, is really, really important, not just to peace and stability, but to actually making sure that we are progressing in sustainable ways. And so having stable rule of law is really, really important. Okay, so first we need a stable rule of law, and then we need to think about a more effective rule of law in the context of environmental challenges such as climate change. Okay, now, at the international level, many of you will know that we have had international climate change law in place since 1992. So for a very long time. And the basis of international climate change law is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has widespread participation. And when I say widespread participation, I literally mean every UN member state is a party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there are 193 UN member states. The other parties to it are like the Cook Islands and the European Union and the Holy Roman See. But what the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change does is it says we as a global community identify global climate change as a problem that we need to collectively address. So we, the United States, are a party to that treaty. We have all acknowledged the reality of climate change. We have a legal treaty that says we have obligations to address it. Now, what it does not do is force change or force action. And so in the ensuing 20 plus, almost 30 years since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted, what we've tried to do at the international level is figure out how to motivate not everyone, but really the big polluters to take steps to reduce their emissions, and then beginning in 2009, to facilitate adaptation at the domestic level and at the international level. This has proved very difficult. Now, along the way, we had the Kyoto Protocol, which many of you will know created legally binding emission reduction obligations. The United States was never party to that. This was not a very effective strategy because it tried to force all of these big, powerful, great power states to do things that they really didn't want to do and they were not motivated to do at the time. And it did not create any obligations for our rapidly developing economies, which is where our emissions were increasing. And so kind of 20 plus years later, we have consensus around the issue, but we're still struggling to find a way to really mobilize international cooperation. And what happened in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, which is our new piece of international climate change law, is we recognize that this is such a complex problem that it's not susceptible to top-down simplistic solutions. That instead what we need to do as a global community is we need to find better ways to cooperate and experiment. And so what the Paris Agreement does, just in the briefest form, is it asks every state, and I'm about to switch to domestic, it asks every state and every UN state to say what they're willing to do to address climate change and why it's fair and ambitious, and then to facilitate cooperation. So we're in a new space in international climate change law where we're trying to focus less on forcing and more on enabling. And we can talk about that if you want to. Now, at the domestic level, what I'll say is that, that was my one picture, here's my picture. At the domestic level, we do not have any climate change legislation. We have the Clean Air Act. And the only thing we have under the Clean Air Act is the ability of our administrative agencies to do whatever the president in power says to do, basically pursuant to the Clean Air Act within some constraints. So to the extent that we really want to do anything at the federal level, we need to either adopt legislation, which is unlikely, or we need to have consistency across administration, because otherwise we're going to end up with a lot of rules like the Clean Power Plan and the tailpipe rules, which just come in and go out and come in and go out. And that is not terribly helpful. But what I do want to say in the last kind of 3 minutes I have left, because I can talk about any level of climate change law for 5 minutes, but what I want to say is that what is happening and where law is really, really proving very interesting is at the sub-federal level and what states are doing with using law to try to mobilize change. And so we have really progressive states like California, which are using law to mobilize change in a whole variety of ways. They're adopting absolute emission reduction obligations. They're adopting renewable portfolio standards, which are really forcing changes in the energy sector, which is where we really need change if we're going to achieve mitigation. But then we also have, the New England states, which have come together to create a market, and so a market in emissions, and so trying to use economic flexibility tools, but using the rule of law to create those and manage them. But then we also have a lot of really interesting work that's being done on mobility and transportation, but also on adaptation issues at the city level, at the state level and at the city level. Because what we realize is that in the context of law and climate change, how you use law to mobilize mitigation efforts versus how you use law to mobilize adaptation efforts is very different. With mitigation, we need more federal level, and we need more state level, and we need more big, high-level changes to our energy systems and our transportation systems. With adaptation, we need to understand better what the particular needs are for particular communities, what kinds of changes will be sustainable, and then figure out how to use local laws and local resources to facilitate those kinds of changes. So we often think of mitigation as being more top-down, and adaptation as being more bottom-up. And so if in the 15 minutes you leave with nothing else, I want you to buy into the idea that rule of law is important as a general matter, that we need to use law better to mobilize change with respect to both mitigation and adaptation, and that law is important at the international level, at the federal level, but also at the sub-federal level. And last but not least, that a lot of what is going to push progressive use of law is not just litigation, which is important, but also the role of non-state actors, so all of the kind of the Bloombergs we're still in, community activism, etc. And so it's a big picture, but it's really, really important, and I'm going to stop and try to leave at least 2 minutes for questions.
Wow, lots of questions. Allison.
So you started your presentation on the need for corporations to make change.
Mm-hmm.
And within the Paris Climate Accord, there were corporations who were involved in some of those discussions, but a lot of the carbon management in that space is happening through these voluntary standards programs. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the interplay of how that has kind of evolved in parallel to what law is attempting to achieve.
And can you please repeat?
Okay, so I mean, I think I'll try to distill the question to make sure I'm answering the right bit too. But it's basically the interplay between corporations and state actors and state-based obligations and voluntary obligations that corporations are taking on. Okay, so the first thing to say is that there are a number of corporate actors who are really trying to change their practices for a variety of reasons. Maybe because of consumer demand, maybe because it saves them money, maybe because they actually have the will to do so. But when we talk about those corporations, we are not generally talking about big fossil fuel companies. And so we tend to think, you know, lots of good things are happening in the space, and that is true. But if you're actually thinking about this, the actors that we really need to get to in terms of mitigation, they're not really part of that. And a lot of what you hear about is more greenwashing than anything else. If you think about the ExxonMobils, the BPs, et cetera. So just first to set that aside. But second, like, I actually think that these voluntary commitments that are being made as pursuant to things like We're Still In, Bloomberg's campaign, are really, really important. Because I think that the more you see it change, the more change facilitates change, right? And so the more socially acceptable it becomes to be green, to be a sustainable company, to reduce emissions, the more that becomes common practice. And so it may not be achieving the emissions reductions we need, but social change is important. And so I think those voluntary changes are critical. I don't think that the Paris Agreement itself is really facilitating those, but I think that the cooperation that took place during the Paris Agreement negotiations and that model of cooperation and experimentation is more facilitative of those efforts. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer.
Andrea.
So you talked about how law is, some states are implementing regulations like California to reduce emissions. What is it? And this kind of crosses what you talked about and what Robin talked about. Why is it that some populations are willing to engage in those kinds of regulations and adopt them, and then other populations aren't? And how can knowledge of human behavior be optimized so that we can get climate change remediation laws in all the states?
So that's a great question, and that's something I thought a lot about when I was actually looking at U.S. versus EU approaches, because I was looking at the federal level and the sub-federal level, and I think there's a variety of answers. I think there's been some research done in the kind of law and social sciences space to try to understand different state motivations, not just in the environmental context, but in otherwise, and they say there's a number of things. First of all, some states have just been historically more blue versus red. Some states also have more faith in bureaucracy than others, and this is like historically kind of, but the reality is we don't really have that and good enough data to know, and so there's a lot more need for research in that area. But it's like a number of factors. So it also comes down to the availability of alternative resources. So for example, in a state like California, they have better access to like solar energy and even wind energy, whereas in the Southeast, that's not the case as well. And so it's a whole variety of factors. But just to give you one tiny example of like how you look at the politics and the personality of the state, because our states have different personalities, and those personalities are developed over years for different reasons. So I don't think I can say it's any one thing or another. But I'm from Texas, right? And in Texas, we're very red. But Texas has also been a real leader in wind energy. And part of the reason for that is because we believe in markets and we believe in innovation. And what happened early on in Texas is that it was a law passed that basically said the utilities had to source a certain amount of their energy from wind. And then it turned out that there was lots of capacity to develop the wind energy market, and then it just took off outside of the regulatory context. And now Texas is the biggest wind energy producer, even as it fights everything EPA is trying to do with respect to the Clean Power Plan. So it's saying wind, renewable energy, and the consumers want it, but no federal regulation because we believe in states' rights. We don't want the federal government telling us what to do, et cetera. So it's a complex set of factors. And that's not an area that I've done a lot of research in personally, because I think we need more granular data, but I actually think it's an area where we need more people to like say, here's why California can and will do this, here's why the northeastern states can, here's why New Mexico is moving in a more progressive way with respect to energy, but here's why Florida is doing what Florida is doing, and Texas is doing what Texas is doing.
All right, thank you so much.